dear colleagues. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining this side event of the Asia-Pacific Trade Facilitation Forum 2022. Today we will discuss proof of origins, and more specifically, we will discuss a way forward to make proofs of origin a concrete trade facilitating measure. And we will have distinguished panelists to discuss the question. But first of all, I would like to introduce you to this topic and explain you the background of this side event, why we have decided to discuss the question, explain you what at the Asian Development Bank we have done as research, conducted as research in the area. And to do that, I will share with you a short presentation so that you can better understand the background of this initiative. All right. So the idea came when we looked at the multitude of free trade agreements in the region. Sorry. As you can see on screen, we're looking at all the different trade agreements, and here we look only at our sub-member countries, but this is applicable to all Asia and the Pacific. We know that there is a noodle bowl of FTA. I think this is something well known. And if you look at even just the RCEP member countries, you see that each of them have already a lot of different agreements in place. But many agreements can be a good thing because it facilitates trade, it makes trade freer. But at the same time, it generates overlapping rules, and also it generates a multitude of different operational certification procedures, which firms and companies, operators have to deal with on a daily basis. And this can be, in fact, quite complex. And this is something we want to discuss today. In fact, here we look just at a few examples of these operational certification procedures, or what we call also sometimes rules of origin administration. And what you can see is that there are a wide variety of operational certification procedures, with mostly certificates of origin issued by a designated authority. So a priori, you may think, okay, but they are relatively similar. It should not be so complicated because it's always a certificate of origin. You have a designated authority, and then, it's relatively similar. But if you look at this more carefully and more closely, you will notice that all these different forms, from D, from E, from A and Z, from all these different forms, they are very different per se. And even the procedures is not always the same. In ASEAN, we know that now we have also discussed over the last few days that we are making progress towards these certificates of origin submitted through the single window, but we also know that it's applicable for the moment in 4 countries. So, we'll still need progress, and so we still have a lot of varieties of different rules applying. So, and to illustrate this, I just show you, so for the same agreements, the differences between those, not only certificates, but between those different operational procedures. So you see, even if you think they are similar with a certificate of origin, you see even the content of a certificate of origin is very different. Sometimes it can be paper-free, but which is not applicable in this case. But the entries of those forms are very different also per se. You have some certificates with many entries, some certificates with less entries, sometimes some administrations that would ask a certain number of copies, 2 or 3, and different boxes, different entries. And so it tends to be quite complex for the private sector to deal with all these elements. And this is only for the certificate, but of course you have also other elements, how you consider accumulation, how you, when you have exporter declaration for low value of shipping, which is quite a trade facilitating per se. The private sector would normally quite like to have these options, but these options is not always available. And So I will not cover all the details here, but basically the idea is to say we have a multitude of different systems, and we would like to discuss today with you, what are the most trade facilitating and how, to move forward towards a roadmap for Asia and the Pacific towards something that would be, more convenient to deal with for the private sector. I would like to discuss about RCEP because at ADB we have conducted some research on RCEP because based on all these different rules, there was this, expectation, very strong expectations when RCEP came into the picture that maybe it will act as this unifying factors, this missing link. And the expectations were high for different reasons, because obviously you have 15 countries, so it's the first opportunity to have something in common. And because of this wide membership, you have also accumulation possibilities, accumulation of inputs. So you have also the possibility to foster regional integration and regional value chains, because you would source more inputs within the region. And the product-specific rules of origin seems a priori or would look like relatively simple because we believe, or it is believed, that most of them are, regional value content rule of 40% or change of tariff classifications. But of course, this is a simplified picture of the reality, because when you look more carefully at the RCEP agreement and you look at exactly what has been negotiated and how it's going to be applicable, we'll see that it's much more complex than that. And to be successful, RCEP or any FTA basically needs to fulfill, let's say, some conditions. Then we need to raise some questions to make sure any FTA is successful. The first is the duty savings, right? First question, if there is a new agreement, does it really provide you enough duty saving so that the private sector would have any kind of incentives to comply with? So this is, to answer this question, you need to conduct an analysis of, the MFN rates or the tariff commitments, look at the preference margin and see if there is a potential benefit. The second question is, are there these product-specific rules of origin easier to comply with than the existing ones in other agreements? Because as you know, you have so many different agreements. If you're a company, you want to export, usually you have several options. You don't have just one agreement. So to make this decision, you will have to combine all these different elements and to think of what is the most profitable. So we need to understand if those rules are more favorable or not. Obviously, accumulation benefits is better when you have more countries in the deal, but then you also need to understand, what are the criteria to see really if it's beneficial or not. So you can look at the form of the rule, if it's regional value content, CTC, or specific operation, working or processing operation, etc. The restrictiveness and also the convergence is if between different agreements, if the rules tends to be similar or not. And the last question, and this is the one we will discuss really more extensively today, is about the administrative procedures related to origin. Because even if the company is able to comply with the rule, because for some reason you are able to produce locally, you have enough local content, then how those rules are, applied at the customs? What are the requirements? What do you need to show at customs to prove that you comply with this rule? And how things work. And this is what we are going to discuss today in the context of trade facilitation. And just to give you a brief idea on these different points, ADB has conducted research already under 1, under 2, and so we are just launching now a new stream of research and discussions, and hopefully also policy dialogue, and also together with other organizations about point 3, about these operational procedures. But about 1, we have already conducted the analysis on RCEP tariffs and benefits, and we have those 2 publications with the links here on screen that looks at already the tariff schedules. We see that it's extremely complex. It goes to 20 years, and most importantly, you have differentiated offers that are also very specific to RCEP and makes the administration of the rule at customs also very complicated, because when you prove the origin and you have differentiated offers, you have very specific challenges, because you have new things that you need to prove that you normally don't need to, right? So it makes also the administration very quite complex. On number 2, the product-specific rules of origin, we have also another publication, so we have looked at this already through the form, where we see you have a lot of CTH and regional value content, because it's inherited from ATIGA, but also some other types of new rule. We have codified the product-specific rules of origin, so basically at the HS 6-digit level, line by line, looking at the different rules, trying to codify, with different, 1, 2, 3 code. If it's less restrictive, intermediate to more restrictive, as compared to ATIGA and CPTPP. And you see that overall, in general, RSAP is not, I would say, always, or it's not necessarily more lenient than existing agreements. And this is more or less the conclusion. You cannot look at RSAP and think, okay, this is really providing more lenient rules, because the results show the reverse. Or not the reverse, but doesn't point towards this conclusion. But something very interesting, despite the fact that unfortunately it's not less restrictive, but we observe some convergence. And this is very important. It means that sometimes, even if the restrictiveness is not exactly similar, we see that many rules are in fact convergent, if not fully convergent, then partially convergent. And this means that we have a high potential for simplification. Because basically when the rules are convergent, it means maybe they are not exactly the same, maybe they are not drafted the same way. But after all, the implications for the private sector is more or less the same. The inputs they will source will be more or less the same. So there is a potential to simplify all the system when there is already convergence. And this is what we want to put forward in our research. And this is also what we would like to do with operational procedures. Basically look at these procedures and look if even if they are different, maybe there is a potential for simplification in convergence. So, but for the case of proof of origin and operational certification procedures, it is clear that desk research is not sufficient. Desk research, we have started to do it, as I show you on screen, by comparing the legal text. And I think this is the most natural thing to start with when you want to understand if an agreement, how to apply an agreement. You look at the legal text. But of course, desk research is not sufficient, because these questions are very practical, and we need, input from practitioners, from private sector, from partners organizations, from also negotiators, so people who have experience in negotiating the agreements themselves. And this is what we're going to do today, this exercise. And if you look at what I call desk research, we're looking at the agreements, the text. Well, you look at Article 3.16 on proof of origin in RSAP, and you see that there is a world of difference between RSAP and CPTPP. So it doesn't seem like, okay, that the new mega regionals really will act as a unifying factor, because they are completely different per se. With the certificate of origin and the certifying authority at the core of the system under RSAP, while it is clear that Article 3.10 of the CPTPP provides for something importer declaration, which is very different and maybe much more trade facilitating. So, of course, there are options in RSAP to negotiate and to improve the system, and that's where further intergovernmental work is needed. And this is also why we want to discuss today how to move forward and have a roadmap to move towards more trade facilitating rules. And just as another illustration here, it's about direct consignment. So sometimes rules are also similar, because between RSAP and CPTPP, basically here on direct consignment, both would need modernization, basically, because none of those two agreements have basically accounted for integrated the non-alteration principle, which would be very trade facilitating. So it's absent in both texts, and this is also something we need maybe to understand, the background, the context, why is it absent, and what we can do together with maybe the advocacy of the private sector to make also policymakers understand that this is one of the most trade facilitating approach, where basically the origin is granted. I mean, it's only when you have a doubt that you would check the requirements. So it's much easier to comply with. So yeah, the non-alteration principle is just like it's not that you're required to demonstrate by principle the direct consignment. It's deemed to be granted. It's only if there is a doubt, basically. Overall, these are just two elements I wanted to discuss now, but of course we cannot cover everything and we need to do further research. But overall, the conclusion is that if you look at RCEP as, or MEGA regionals in general as a unifying factor, it seems that we still have a lot of work to do, because on point 1 and 2, we have conducted the research already. And as I said, we need further intergovernmental work to move toward convergence and to have a more tariff dismantling. And there is a built-in agenda under RCEP, so we can leverage on this built-in agenda and try to orient, I would say, future negotiations. And on operational certification procedures, at first glance, if you look just at the text, it doesn't seem either to have really strong, significant improvement. While we know that this is one of the most reported non-tariff measures by firm, it's extremely complex to comply with. And so I think it's a very important stream of research that we are going to start now with your help. And last but not least, these three elements also show something important: the importance of having a better monitoring system of FTAs in general. Because you have seen at the beginning, we signed a lot of different trade agreements, but understanding how, if they really function in practice, is something we need to know. We need to have more information about this. And utilization rate is a tool that is used by the WTO, by different organizations, that has been in fact collected a long time ago by UNCTAD initially. And it's used even by my own country, Switzerland, and many other countries to monitor the effectiveness of trade agreements. So, and here you have an important role of customs, because these are customs data, and my colleague Stefano from UNCTAD will talk a bit more about this later, and why this is extremely important, because it will also help identify where we need to improve these operational certification procedures, because obviously if they are too stringent, utilization will be extremely low. So today we discuss, how to reform rules of origin in this trade facilitating manner. What are the best practices? We will hear from distinguished speakers in a, would say, wide consultative process, starting with different research and development partners on TAD, UNSCAP, who are going to share their long-standing experience with these different elements, and e-certificates from UNSCAP. We'll hear perspectives from policymakers, or how complex it is to, when you have to draft those regulations, hearing from a former ASEAN Secretary of Staff who is now consulting for us, Pan Manha. And it's very highly appreciated. We also will have the participation of private sector, who agreed to come today to share with you their challenges, and also share the best practices in the area. And we hope this is the beginning of a long-standing policy dialogue. Thank you very much. And I will leave the floor now to Stefano for his presentation on utilization rate, and in the ASEAN region, which will show why the topic is also quite important for today. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Pramila, and welcome to everybody. I think we start with the issue of utilization rate that has just been introduced by Pramila. And what utilization rates of what? Of course, utilization rates of free trade area agreement, in the sense that the governments, they are negotiating agreements in order to create free trade, but at the end of the game, the firms are using the agreement or not using the agreement. And that's the topic that I'm going to address in this presentation. I think that Pramila spoke about the RCEP, which is the late, the new girl in town that has been prompted by policymakers as why newest, most effective agreements, but then comes the moment of the truth. In the sense, are these agreements going to be utilized? And in the studies that we have done at UNCTAD, but also in cooperation with WTO and with ADB, we found that many of these agreements were not effectively utilized by firms. And then comes the second question is, why the agreements are signed by politicians and not used by firms? That's the real question. And then comes the utilization rates. And the utilization rates is customs data. And the customs data tell the truth in the sense if the agreement has been used by firms or not. And then comes another question, say, well, if the agreement is not used, why? It has not been used. Why the firms? Because the firms are making profits, and if you don't pay duties, it's profit, it's money. So why the firms are not using this? And then we need to come with some explanation on why the firms are not using these free trade agreements. And then we are doing with some facts and some myths why firms are not using, and that's the topic of my presentation today, and some work ahead. The first thing that we need to explain is the mechanics of data on utilization rate. And basically, as I said, is customs based. There are data that are collected by customs. And normally, how does it work? It works that when you present the goods to customs, you have a certificate of origin, and you have a packing list, you have a bill of lading, you make a custom declaration. If everything is in order, fine. You are being granted the preferential rate of duty, which could be duty-free or reduced rate of duty, and all is fine, and you are effectively utilizing the agreement. But what about if you don't have a certificate of origin? What about if there is some discrepancy between the certificate of origin and the packing list? Then the problem arises, and then customs may not be granting you the preferential rate of duty which you're supposed to have, and therefore you're not using the agreement. But why you're not using the agreement? Well, most of the time we think, and we believe that you're not using the agreement because the rules of origin are too stringent, because you're not being able to reach the regional value content of 40%, or because your documents, are not in order at the time in which you present the goods to customs. So it is important to understand the reason why the agreements, the FTA, has not been used, and the utilization rate, is one of the tools that we have at disposal to clearly identify the reason why an agreement has not been used. And in our research, we found out that the agreement has not been used because the rules of origin are too stringent, or because the administrative procedures related to proof of origin are cumbersome. There are other reasons that are being brought forward for the reason non-utilization, which is the preferential margin is too low, because the preferential margin is 2-3%, and therefore firms are not using the agreements because it's too much paperwork in order to comply with rules of origin, and therefore they don't bother to use the agreement. But we found that this is largely anecdotal. It is not being driven, and it's not being validated by the firms. Firms, we found out in our research that most of the time they use, or they want to use effectively the agreement, and even if the preferential margin is low. There are also other findings, that some firms, they are not using the agreement because simply they do not know that the agreement is existing. But also we found that this is largely anecdotal, because the firms, especially multinational firms, they're very much aware I mean, that an agreement is existing. The problem of ignorance of the existence of an agreement is mostly related to small and medium-sized enterprises, and where, I mean, the governments and international organizations should make efforts to make this agreement publicly available to the public. The public information that has to be given to the public. Now, how does it make, how it is calculated, the utilization rate? Basically is the amount of trade flows that are covered, that are eligible for an agreement, divided by the amount of trade flows that have been granted preferential rate of duty at the time of importation. So you need, I mean, you present, there is an amount of trade flows that are supposed to be eligible to be granted preferential treatment, and the customs are also collecting at the same time the amount of trade that has been effectively been given preferential treatment at the time of importation. The division, you divide, I mean, these two amounts, and you have the utilization, the effective utilization rate of an agreement. Now, let me go, I mean, to some of the myths, you know, of why, I mean, some agreements are not used. There is a school of thought, you know, in saying that if the preferential margin are low, the preferential margin is the difference between the normal rate of duty and the preferential rate of duty. The normal rate of duty, for instance, for cars in the United States is 2.5%. The rules of origin were quite difficult to comply with. Nevertheless, the people comply. I mean, the large automotive producer based in Canada or in Mexico, they make the most in order to comply with these rules of origin, even if the preferential margin is low, is 2.5%. But if a preferential margin is low, multiplied by the trade volumes of imports of cars into the United States, they make a huge amount of money, and that's why automotive companies are complying with the rules of origin of the United States, Mexico, and Canada free trade area agreement, even if a preferential margin is low, because multiplied by the amount of trade flows, you make hundreds of millions of dollars, which, you know, for a firm is profit, you know, that, or if you want to say it, duty savings. So what is important is not really, we found out, but what is important and what drives firms to use FTAs is not really preferential margin, but it is the volume of a transaction. Because the volume of a transaction, you know, times the preferential margin is what a firm is saving in terms of duty. And now, what also drives the use of firms of free trade area agreement is the sector in which you are working. The automotive sector is very competitive, so even a tiny preferential margin makes for you a difference. Or in the steel sector, you know, the steel sector is highly competitive. You know, even a tiny preferential margin, which is a duty savings for you, makes a lot in terms of profit margins. By contrast, if you think of the textile and clothing, if you think of the Gucci, Prada, Moncler, for them, they have a very high profit margin of 30, 40%, and therefore even a high preferential margin of 5, 6% for them is negligible because they have such a profit margin in their own sector, which may forego the preferential margin, and therefore may be at time affording or not using FTAs. So, I mean, we have to be sector specific, and we have to take into account the profit margin are the drivers of the utilization of trade preferences by firms rather than the preferential margins. What we found out in our research is that the product-specific rules of origin are, in fact, a driver of utilization rate. The more the product-specific rules of origin are lenient, the more the firms are using because they are easier to comply with, the lenient product-specific rules of origin. So if the product-specific rules of origin are more lenient, the firms are inclined to use more the free trade area agreement. We conducted an analysis for the LDC countries, least developed countries at WTO, in a study that we did, and we found out that when Canada and the European Union, they introduced more lenient rules of origin for least developed countries. I mean, these least developed countries exports, we're talking about countries of the region like Cambodia, Bangladesh. There has been a sudden increase of export of textile and clothing, but not only textile and clothing, but also other products like bicycle from the LDC countries to the markets of Canada and the European Union. So there has been a link, a direct link, but also has been validated by counterfactuals with companies. And also we did a study containing a regression, an economic regression, linking the fact that product-specific rules of origin that are more lenient are generating a higher utilization rate and a higher volume of trade from the beneficiary countries. Obviously, we also find out that the leniency of stringency of a product-specific rules of origin has to be related to the country, in the sense that the same product-specific rules of origin applied in China, that has a large manufacturing capacity, is not the same when is applied in Cambodia, where the amount of inputs supporting industries are much more limited than in China. The number two factor that we found out that is driving utilization rate is the complexity of proof of origin, which is the topic, I mean, that we are discussing in this workshop more specifically. And we are seeing in our research that the documentary evidence related to the proof of origin is what effectively drives utilization or the not utilization by firms of free trade area agreements. A requirement like documentary evidence of direct consignment. What does it mean, direct consignment? When you sending your goods to your clients, sometimes you don't consign directly, but you consign through a third countries. If you're shipping them from Singapore to South Korea, perhaps you can pass via Hong Kong, and therefore you need to demonstrate according to the direct shipment requirement that the goods that has been transshipped in Hong Kong, they remain under custom control. So that's need a kind of no manipulation certificate, which sometimes is not easy to have. So this kind of paper evidence, which is related to the fulfillment of a proof of origin, is the contrary of trade facilitating. That's that's an obstacle to the utilization of the trade preferences by firms of free trade areas. And we found out that not only direct consignment, but also other certification requirements related to suppliers declaration, or third country invoicing, which is a practice that sometimes you don't sell directly to your customers, but you sell to an intermediary, and then the intermediary is reselling to the final customer. Now, how do you prove rules of origin? Because you produce the good, but you're not sold the goods. And that's at the time of customs clearance, you need to provide evidence that the goods is originating, even if the goods has been sold to the final customers by an intermediary. So all this, relates to a paperwork which has to be provided at the time of customs clearance in order to be granted the trade preferences. Now, these requirements are those that are the real drivers of utilization rate by firms, because if you don't accept a third country invoice, that's basically you are not allowing the use of this intermediary trade, which actually drives world trade, because most of the time you don't sell directly to your country, but you sell through an intermediary. If the paperwork related to allow the use of free trade area when you're selling through intermediary is not facilitating, you end up not using the trade preferences. So that's the kind of reasons that we have identified that drives utilization rates. And also, we conducted, I mean, with Deloitte, a kind of survey on what drives a firm in using a free trade area or not. And then we found out that, of course, I mean, the level of duty preference is one of the drivers, but also the margins in the industry, and also the flexibility and the sourcing. How does it cost in terms of sourcing to comply with rules of origin? Because if I have a requirement of reasonable value content of 40%, what does it take to comply for me with that requirement in terms of a firm's decision to use or not to use a trade preferences? These are all the drivers of utilization, the drivers, the real reasons why firms are using or not using trade preferences and free trade area agreement. Now, we're coming to the challenges, because obviously the utilization rate, I mean, they tell you, I mean, the utilization rate, I mean, can be high, it can be low, you know, and they tell you that an agreement is working or not working properly, but it doesn't tell you why. You know, that's the main reason that we need to explore better, and that, I mean, is the work of this workshop and the work ahead on research, is to you have a low or a high utilization rate, but then you need to interpret this finding. It's like a kind of medical exam. Then you've got a scan, but then, I mean, the doctor has to read the scan in order to interpret what the scan is telling you. And so in this kind of game, there is not a magic solution. You also need to understand that there is when you tell to the policymakers that an agreement is not working, it's not going to be happy. So there is a kind of denial mode by government in saying, no, but the agreement is working correctly. That on the other hand, the utilization rate is a factual, you know, that shows that an agreement is working or not working properly. Now, the point, I mean, is that you need to tell to the policymakers, and you know, that you redress a low utilization rate is not working for this reason, and you need to provide to the policymaker a concrete and practical way to remedy to a low utilization rate. And that's why, I mean, we are saying that the new research, the research that we are undertaking, should be practical, in the sense that need to be acted upon by governments. We're going to provide to governments practical reforms on how to address low utilization rate. Another issue that we need to raise is the fact that utilization rate are not publicly available. I mean, we have utilization rate, for instance, that I'm going to show of ASEAN free trade areas, of ATIGA, but for instance, we don't have, because they are not publicly available, the utilization rate of free trade area agreements on free trade area agreements with dialogue partners. You know, all the FTAs that Pramila has been showing at the beginning of this presentation. Now, I want to show you, I mean, some figures of utilization rates, which is the ATIGA. The ATIGA is the ASEAN Trade Groups Agreements, is one of the long-standing trade agreements in the region. And what we found out, and there has been a study that we did with Pramila and Ha, that utilization rate of ATIGA, which is the most long-standing, and everybody knows that has been existing there, I mean, since 2009. Well, the utilization rate in 2016, 2018 has been equal to 50%, which is low. I mean, if you compare, I mean, the utilization rate of trade preferences granted to LDCs, which are the poorest country in the world, you know, I mean, they make up to 90%. The ATIGA is only 50%, and has been there since more than a decade. That's worrisome. So we calculated what are the duty savings that have been lost by firms, and we came to a figure of 3.6 billion of duty savings that has not been materialized because of rules of origin and related procedures. So that's, I mean, a big message to the policymakers. Where are, I mean, these duty savings been missed? And then you will see some figures in this slide that, for instance, when Malaysia is exporting to Thailand, as much as $339 million of duty savings has not been materialized because of rules of origin and difficult proof of origin that are related to. And then, I mean, there are also, it's not only related to trade between Malaysia and Thailand, but also between Singapore and Thailand, $175. And when Singapore is exporting to Vietnam, it has paid, I mean, $87 million of duties, I mean, that should have not been paid. Then, I mean, we have, of course, I mean, more detailed on where these duties are being paid. And in here, there are the number of tariff lines. We can see, I mean, that there are not many tariff lines. I mean, I would say the tariff lines, I mean, where we had a problem are in the realm of 100 tariff line. I mean, that they have been exported by Malaysia to Thailand, which were paid duties, why they should have been paid duties. Then we can show even the products. You know, you will see that here in this slide, Malaysia exporting to Thailand, the product that has paid, I mean, most of the duties, but is LCD devices, you know, which are, I mean, used widely in IT. But also petroleum oils, and we know, I mean, that Malaysia is exporting petroleum oils, and we know that it is a Malaysian product. Why has paid the duty instead of, and we see that a significant fraction, $24 million are paid duties, you know, and why so? If everybody knows that petroleum oils are originating in Malaysia, so there should have been a problem, but instead there has been a problem. Well, obviously there are other figures, you know, which, I mean, we can discuss at a later stage, but also the point is that what is the work ahead? And well, I mean, the work ahead is that these figures, I mean, they clearly show that there are, even if ATIGA has been there, I mean, for more than a decade, we still have problems in implementing ATIGA. And we have a low utilization rate. There are also, what are the utilization rate of other free trade area agreements that ASEAN has signed with China, with Japan? What will be the utilization rate of RCEP, which is the newcomer? These are the issues that we are going to examine with ADB. And the aim, I mean, is to provide also, if utilization rates are low, then the final aim is also to provide to government a remedy to that. So a series of reforms that have to be done on rules of origin and proof of origin in order to increase the utilization rates. And that's been the ultimate result of our research. And obviously, most recently, we also carried out some work for the T20, because as you may know, of rules of origin, there is not a kind of multilateral agreement of rules of origin. And so we are urging, I mean, the T20 to renew negotiation on multilateral level in order to get to a common understanding of the rules of origin, since the multilateral trading system needs, I mean, such a kind of discipline on rules of origin. I thank you very much, and then for your attention, and then we can move to the next speaker.
Thank you very much, Stefano.